Irenaeus, also referred to as Saint Irenaeus, was Bishop of Lugdunum in Gaul, then a part of the Roman Empire. He was an early church father and apologist, and his writings were formative in the early development of Christian theology. He was a hearer of Polycarp, who in turn was traditionally a disciple of John the Evangelist. Irenaeus' best-known book, Adversus Heresies or Against Heresies, is a detailed attack on Gnosticism, which was then a serious threat to the Church, and especially on the system of the Gnostic Valentinus. As one of the first great Christian theologians, he emphasized the traditional elements in the Church, especially the episcopate, scripture, and tradition, against the Gnostics, who said that they possessed a secret oral tradition from Jesus himself. Irenaeus maintained that the bishops in different cities are known as far back as the apostles, and that the bishops provided the only safe guide to the interpretation of Scripture. His writings, with those of Clement and Ignatius, are taken as among the earliest signs of the developing doctrine of the primacy of the Roman See. Irenaeus is the earliest witness to recognition of the canonical character of all four Gospels. Irenaeus is recognized as a saint in both Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. His feast day is on June 28 in the general Roman calendar, where it was inserted for the first time in 1920. In 1960, the Catholic Church transferred it to July 3, leaving June 28 for the vigil of the Feast of Saints Peter and Paul, but in 1969 it was returned to June 28, the day of his death. The Lutheran Church commemorates Irenaeus on that same date for his life of exemplary Christian witness. In the Orthodox Church his feast day is the 23rd of August. Biography. Irenaeus was born during the first half of the 2nd century, and he is thought to have been a Greek from Polycarp's hometown of Smyrna in Asia Minor, now Izmir, Turkey. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he was brought up in a Christian family rather than converting as an adult. During the persecution of Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor from 161 to 180, Irenaeus was a priest of the Church of Lyon. The clergy of that city, many of whom were suffering imprisonment for the faith, sent him in 177 to Rome with a letter to Pope Eleuterus concerning the heresy Montanism, and that occasion bore emphatic testimony to his merits. While Irenaeus was in Rome, a massacre took place in Lyon. Returning to Gaul, Irenaeus succeeded the martyr Saint Pothinus and became the second bishop of Lyon. During the religious peace which followed the persecution of Marcus Aurelius, the new bishop divided his activities between the duties of a pastor and of a missionary. Almost all his writings were directed against Gnosticism. The most famous of these writings is Adversus Heresies. Irenaeus alludes to coming across Gnostic writings, and holding conversations with Gnostics, and this may have taken place in Asia Minor or in Rome. However, it also appears that Gnosticism was present near Lyon. He writes that there were followers of Magus the magician, living and teaching in the Rhone Valley. Little is known about the career of Irenaeus after he became bishop. The last action reported of him is that in 190 or 191, he exerted influence on Pope Victor I not to excommunicate the Christian communities of Asia Minor, which persevered in the practice of the Quartodeciman celebration of Easter. Nothing is known of the date of his death, which must have occurred at the end of the 2nd or the beginning of the 3rd century. A few within the Roman Catholic Church and Orthodox Church celebrate him as a martyr. He was buried under the Church of St. John in Lyon, which was later renamed St. Irenaeus in his honor. The tomb and his remains were utterly destroyed in 1562 by the Huguenots. Writings. Irenaeus wrote a number of books, but the most important that survives is the Against Heresies. In Book 1, Irenaeus talks about the Valentinian Gnostics and their predecessors, who go as far back as the magician Simon Magus. In Book 2 he attempts to provide proof that Valentinianism contains no merit in terms of its doctrines. In Book 3 Irenaeus purports to show that these doctrines are false, by providing counter-evidence gleaned from the Gospels. Book IV consists of Jesus' sayings, and here Irenaeus also stresses the unity of the Old Testament and the Gospel. In the final volume, Book V, Irenaeus focuses on more sayings of Jesus plus the letters of Paul the Apostle. The purpose of Against Heresies was to refute the teachings of various Gnostic groups. Apparently, several Greek merchants had begun an oratorial campaign in Irenaeus' bishopric, teaching that the material world was the accidental creation of an evil god, from which we are to escape by the pursuit of gnosis. Irenaeus argued that the true gnosis is in fact knowledge of Christ, which redeems rather than escapes from bodily existence. Until the discovery of the Library of Nag Hammadi in 1945, Against Heresies was the best surviving description of Gnosticism. According to some biblical scholars, the findings at Nag Hammadi have shown Irenaeus' description of Gnosticism to be largely inaccurate and polemic in nature, though correct in some details about the belief systems of various groups. Irenaeus' main purpose was to warn Christians against Gnosticism, rather than catalogue those beliefs. He described Gnostic groups as sexual libertines, for example, when some of their own writings advocated chastity more strongly than did Orthodox texts, yet the Gnostic texts cannot be taken as guides to their actual practices, about which almost nothing is reliably known today. However, at least one scholar, Rodney Stark, claims that it is the same Nag Hammadi library that proves Irenaeus right. It seemed that Irenaeus' critiques against the Gnostics were exaggerated, which led to his scholarly dismissal for a long time. For example, he wrote, "They declare that Judas the traitor was thoroughly acquainted with these things, and that he alone, knowing the truth as no other did, accomplished the mystery of betrayal. By him all things were thus thrown into confusion. They produce a fictitious history of this kind, which they style the Gospel of Judas. These claims turned out to be truly mentioned in the Gospel of Judas, where Jesus asked Judas to betray him. In any case, the Gnostics were not a single group, but a wide array of sects. Some groups were indeed libertine because they considered bodily existence meaningless, others praised chastity, and strongly prohibited any sexual activity, even within marriage." Irenaeus also wrote The Demonstration of the Apostolic Preaching, an Armenian copy of which was discovered in 1904. This work seems to have been an instruction for recent Christian converts. Eusebius attests to other works by Irenaeus, today lost, including on the Adot, an entitled Letter to Blastus regarding schism, on the subject of knowledge, on the monarchy or how God is not the cause of evil. Irenaeus exercised wide influence on the generation which followed. Both Hippolytus and Tertullian freely drew on his writings. However, none of his works aside from Against Heresies and the Demonstration of the Apostolic Preaching survive today, perhaps because his literal hope of an earthly millennium may have made him uncongenial reading in the Greek East. Even though no complete version of Against Heresies in its original Greek exists, we possess the full ancient Latin version, probably of the 3rd century, as well as 33 fragments of a Syrian version and a complete Armenian version of books 4 and 5. Irenaeus' works were first translated into English by John Keble and published in 1872 as part of the Library of the Fathers series. Scripture. Irenaeus pointed to Scripture as a proof of Orthodox Christianity against heresies, classifying as Scripture not only the Old Testament but most of the books now known as the New Testament, while excluding many works, a large number by Gnostics, that flourished in the 2nd century and claimed scriptural authority. Oftentimes, Irenaeus, as a student of Polycarp, who was a direct disciple of the Apostle John, believed that he was interpreting scriptures in the same hermeneutic as the apostles. This connection to Christ was important to Irenaeus because both he and the Gnostics based their arguments on Scripture. Irenaeus argued that since he could trace his authority to Christ and the Gnostics could not, his interpretation of Scripture was correct. He also used the Rule of Faith, a proto-creed, with similarities to the Apostles' Creed. as a hermeneutical key to argue that his interpretation of Scripture was correct. Before Irenaeus, Christians differed as to which gospel they preferred. The Christians of Asia Minor preferred the Gospel of John. The Gospel of Matthew was the most popular overall. Irenaeus asserted that 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were canonical scripture. Thus Irenaeus provides the earliest witness to the assertion of the 4 canonical Gospels, possibly in reaction to Marcion's edited version of the Gospel of Luke, which Marcion asserted was the one and only true Gospel, based on the arguments Irenaeus made in support of only 4 authentic Gospels. Some interpreters deduce that the fourfold Gospel must have still been a novelty in Irenaeus' time. Against Heresies 3:11.7 acknowledges that many heterodox Christians use only one Gospel, while 3:11.9 acknowledges that some use more than 4. The success of Tatian's Diates Aaron in about the same time period is a powerful indication that the fourfold Gospel contemporaneously sponsored by Irenaeus was not broadly, let alone universally, recognized. Irenaeus is also the earliest attestation that the Gospel of John was written by John the Apostle, and that the Gospel of Luke was written by Luke, the companion of Paul. The apologist and ascetic Tatian had previously harmonized the 4 Gospels into a single narrative, the Diates Aaron. Scholars contend that Irenaeus quotes from 21 of the 27 New Testament texts: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts of the Apostles, Romans chapter 1, Corinthians chapter 2, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians chapter 1, Thessalonians 2, Thessalonians chapter 1, Timothy chapter 2, Timothy, Titus chapter 1, Peter chapter 1, John chapter 2, John, Revelation to John. He may refer to Hebrews and James and maybe even to Peter, but does not cite Philemon, 3 John or Jude. Irenaeus cited the New Testament approximately 1,000 times. About 1/3 of his citations are made to Paul's letters. Irenaeus considered all 13 letters belonging to the Pauline corpus to have been written by Paul himself. Apostolic authority. Irenaeus is also known as one of the first theologians to use the principle of apostolic succession to refute his opponents. In his writing against the Gnostics, who claimed to possess a secret oral tradition from Jesus himself, Irenaeus maintained that the bishops in different cities are known as far back as the apostles, and that the bishops provided the only safe guide to the interpretation of Scripture. In a passage that became a locus classicus of Catholic-Protestant polemics, he cited the Roman Church as an example of the unbroken chain of authority which text-Western polemics would use to assert the primacy of Rome over Eastern churches by virtue of its preeminent authority. With the lists of bishops to which Irenaeus referred, the doctrine of the apostolic succession, firmly established in the Church at this time, of the bishops could be linked. This succession was important to establish a chain of custody for orthodoxy. He felt it important, however, to also speak of a succession of elders. Irenaeus' point when refuting the Gnostics was that all of the apostolic churches had preserved the same traditions and teachings in many independent streams. It was the unanimous agreement between these many independent streams of transmission that proved the orthodox faith, current in those churches, to be true. Had any error crept in, the agreement would be immediately destroyed.